I'm going to assume we're live. Welcome, everybody, to panel 2C as part of the National Symposium on Race and Social Issues here going on at Howard as part of our homecoming. This is panel 2C, where we're going to talk about promoting environmental, social, and climate justice at Howard University and how Howard can be instrumental in that exercise and that objective. We have an eclectic group of academics here with us. I will be, so the panelists are listed over here. We have myself, I will be speaking, so all of us will be making short presentations, and then following that, we will open this up for a forum, a discussion, Q&A, and so forth. So I'm going to allow the panelists to, to introduce themselves more specifically as they wish to, but let me just briefly say that we have amongst our panelists here, myself, an engineer. I'm a professor of chemical engineering, Professor Charles Verharen, who is a professor of philosophy, Professor George Middendorf, who is a professor of biology, Professor Ronil, Hira, who is in the Department of Political Science, a professor of political science, and Dr. Schwartzman. I'm sorry, I think I just lost there we go. Dr. Schwartzman, who is actually a professor emeritus and professor emeritus of environmental science and climate science. And so all of us will be presenting talks as listed probably in the program. And those will be about 7 to 8 minutes. And then we will open up for discussion. So going forward, I'm going to be the first presenter. And so what I'd like to do is put my screen up here, see if, first I need to stop that share and try and share my presentation. There it is. Why is this not going? Let's go down. There we go. There we go. Okay, so I'm a professor of chemical engineering, and I hold various hats. I'm a faculty advisor to Engineers Without Borders, Howard University. I'm a visiting professor at an engineering college in Kerala, India, and I've spent a couple of years in India doing Fulbrights. And what I want to focus on really is what we need to do in terms of educating our engineers for justice. As a precursor or a prelude to all this, or what's a theme, overarching all this is what Howard is all about. And what Howard is all about is social justice. And so what I like to start with from a technology perspective is where you can actually drink the water. And what you can see over here is that that's less than 10% of the world's population that can actually drink the water. And who makes that possible? It's engineers and technologists. It's engineering systems that make this sort of thing possible. And in addition to where you can drink the water, there are a lot of other things that we take for granted. And these are what I call the necessities for a flourishing life. We have a clean environment, we have a temperature controlled space, clean water, clean air, energy accessible to us whenever we need. All we need to do is turn on a switch. We can go to the grocery store. We have healthcare. Well, I hope we have healthcare. There's a financial infrastructure we have access to, transportation infrastructure, a communication infrastructure, all of that is made possible, that makes possible our life of flourishing. In fact, that is what makes this gathering itself possible. Okay, and engineers are what makes that happen. But guess what? Almost half the planet, more than half the planet, cannot drink the water. Okay, so how are we going to change that? What are we going to do about this problem? I mean, this is the state of life for many people. You know, if we're enjoying all of these things that I've just shown over here, we're maybe 7 or 10% of the global population that have access to all of that. A small minority. A lot of people need a lot more, and that's shown over here. 1 billion people without access to safe, potable water. More than 2.5 billion people without access to sanitation. So the negative stats go on, and these are failings in our time. I mean, think of it. We are here when at this time, there are people who can, billionaires, who are paying $200,000 to reserve a seat to fly into space for a jaunt in zero gravity. If that's technologically possible, I don't see why we could make this whole thing actually blue. So what we really need to do is educate Howard engineers on developing and researching the kind of appropriate technologies that do address global community issues and make the kind of flourishing environment for all of us, that make it possible for all of us. We need to educate Howard engineers about equity. You know, we're all familiar with representative equity, we're familiar with social equity, we're beginning to be aware of environmental racism and talking about, but nobody talks about resource equity, nobody talks about energy equity. Those are things that Howard engineers need to be educated about. They need to be educated about resource, energy, and technology justice. That's what will get us moving towards the you know, that land that we want to be in. I mean, we have to talk about educating these engineers to address the sustainable development goals. I mean, as an aside, you know, after 50 years of development, we're still trying to get people clean water. That's an incredible failing. So engineers also must be prepared to address the grand challenges that have been set forth for us as a global population going forward. And, you know, one of the things we need to talk to them about is how we got to this position. How did we get to a place where we see so much red? Many of our students are coming from places like that, which is all red, where they cannot drink the tap water. Okay, how did we get there? Well, just as short, I don't want to take too much time, but these are countries that Britain has not invaded, okay? Like what, maybe 4, 5 countries across the planet? So what we're talking about is a history of resource, wealth, and technology transfer that for 400 or 500 years was simply plunder, resource extraction. The technology development that was put in place was technology that supported that resource extraction and export. Why else do we have such a wonderful railway system in India? Why is there a railway going from Mombasa from Mombasa up into the, you know, into Nairobi and Kenya? Because they wanted to be able to extract those resources. They weren't worried about developing people. And then we had independence, we had decolonization, and we then had 40 or 70 years of professional development. We had the World Bank, the IMF, the German development agencies. And what are they doing? They're trying to develop. They professionalized poverty is what they did, okay? They professionalized poverty, and in that development, the net wealth transfer was actually from the global south to the global north. So these are things that we need to educate our Howard engineers on. We need to inform them about the development paradigm that is actually a development divide. We don't need white men in white coats telling brown people on farmland what they need to be doing and how they need to improve their lives. We need to incorporate models that are circular, that are sustainable, and that are agroecological. Things that promote primary resource development and that promote the production of wealth from those primary resources and keeping that wealth in the community. And an excellent example of this is the Songhai Agroecological Center in Benin. That's Father Godfrey Zamujo that you see over there, which where They actually have a circular resource economy within a community, and they're providing the sort of knowledge base to disseminate that model for actual development and poverty eradication and growing wealth. So with that, I'd like to stop and just say that, so we're gonna discuss these issues together once everybody has made their presentations. So I'm now going to, so we're going to go forward in this order: Professor George Middendorf, then Professor Hira will talk about environmental workforce diversity. I'm sorry, Dr. Middendorf will be speaking about environmental justice issues around Howard University. Professor Schwartzman will talk about climate change and climate justice. And then Professor Verharen from the Department of Philosophy will talk about promoting social justice at Howard. So I'm going to stop the share and
Dr. Tharakan?
Yes, yes, sir.
I believe Dr. Hira is up next, and then I follow him.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I had the order wrong. Okay, let me just get Ron's. Ready, Ron.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Dr. Tharakan. So I'm in the political science department, but I work on specifically public policy issues, and my area is employment policy, and in particular around science and engineering workforce. So given the theme that we're talking about in terms of environment, I thought I'd give you a little bit of some ideas about what we could do to diversify the environmental workforce. Next slide, please. So as you'll hear from some of the other panelists, climate change is transformative. It's going to impact just about everything that we do in society. On the private sector side, how we live, what type of jobs that we have, but also on the public sector side and what we need to learn in terms of education. We know that diverse teams, so when you have a workforce team that is diverse, that actually enhances problem solving. Those diverse teams are more innovative and creative in terms of their solutions. They can identify problems better, and problems that non-diverse teams just are not aware of and don't know about. But we know that if we look at the environmental workforce, so these are people that are in jobs on environmental control or in engineering, as Dr. Tharakan talked about, that the environmental workforce is not diverse, and that in fact racial diversity or disparities persist. In addition to driving innovation and better problem solving, a more diverse workforce would drive equity. We need to have people who have a seat at the table, a diverse group of people with the seat at the table in terms of decision making. And green jobs are some of the fastest growing if you look at the Department of Labor statistics and forecasts, even over the last few years, but projecting out over the next 10 years or so, green jobs are going to be amongst the most fastest growing. So let's take a quick look. What I'm going to show in the next 3 slides are a brief look at some of the data. And this is just initial analysis. We'll look at the education pipeline, and then the labor market, and then the federal workforce. So this first graph shows you Black graduates in environmental fields. So some of the core environmental fields that feed into those jobs. And these are bachelor's degrees. What you see at the bottom there, that bottom bar chart, is for all fields, and this is in management and professional. So in all fields, Blacks account for about 10% of bachelor's degrees. But if you look at agriculture and natural resources, the second to the bottom bar there in red, it's only 3%. So only about 30% the rate in agriculture and natural resources, Blacks represent that share in terms of bachelor's degrees. So obviously we're not graduating. We don't have the education pipeline in terms of Blacks going into these fields. So that's the education side. let's go to the next slide. If we look at this table, what this shows is basically in the workforce right now. So the education was the future workforce. This is the current workforce. And I've pulled out just a couple of examples of environmental fields. So on the right-hand side in the lower part of the table, you see the percentages of environmental and geoscientists, for example, is 4.8%. So only 4.8% of all environmental scientists are Black. That compares, if you look at the top where the arrow is, to about 10% of all professional workers. So Blacks account for 10% of all professional workers, but they're a much smaller share in those key areas, those key occupations in environmental. So there's a disparity there. If you go back. So this last one I want to point out, and this is an important public policy. I mentioned that I work on public policy issues. One of the key ways that we increase diversity is through our federal hiring practices. And I was a bit surprised by this looking at the data here, but the federal workforce in many of the key agencies that do environmental work actually lags behind even the overall occupations. So let me just focus on the Department of Interior. Less than 1% of the people who work in natural resource management at the Department of Interior, this is a federal government agency, less than 1% are Black. That's really way behind what we would expect, even from the showings in terms of the occupations that are there. So the federal workforce is obviously not doing what we would expect. So how do we improve workforce diversity? Well, we need to expand education capacity, so we need to build that pipeline up. And the best way to do that is by government supporting research at HBCUs. If you want to expand the academic pipeline, the clear-cut way to do that is to expand research funding. And what that does is it expands the number of faculty who can be hired, it attracts better faculty, and then you can start to actually graduate more students. Secondly, we need to do something around federal hiring programs. So the federal government, as I showed in the previous slide, is lagging behind. And so we need to spread some of the best practices to some of those agencies that are hiring lots of environmental workers. And the third piece there is student awareness. And so, you know, polls show that Gen Z and the next generation beyond Gen Z's right now in college, have this very strong interest in climate change and want to drive climate change policies and work. And there's clear educational opportunities and pathways need to be articulated so that people are attracted to go into those fields. So what's Howard University's role? We're already doing work on this, looking at evidence-based approaches to identify these disparities in both labor market outcomes and educational pipeline, to come up with identifying clearly what the causes are and give practical solutions, and also to shine a light on the problems. In terms of teaching, we've got an environmental studies program that was recently launched about 3 years ago, a bachelor's degree in environmental studies, and there's a proposal to create a Department of Earth, Environment, and Equity. So that will go up from bachelor's all the way up to the PhD level. And then in terms of service, working with policymakers, federal agencies, foundations, and NGOs to improve outcomes. So, you know, I look forward to our Q&A and look forward to getting some of your ideas. I think that's part of what this presentation is about. This discussion is to really have a dialogue and get some of your ideas about what we can do next. Thanks.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I was muted. Thank you very much, Dr. Hira. That was great. We're going to segue right into Dr. Middendorf. Do I have your presentation up?
Yes, you do. Just click it so it's the slideshow rather than the.
Okay, great. Excellent. There we go.
There we go. Thank you, John.
Sure.
So I am glad. My name is George Middendorf. I'm in the Department of Biology. I've been at Howard for almost 4 decades. I am in one of the disciplines that Dr. Hira just mentioned as being woefully short in terms of participation by students from traditionally underrepresented groups. And it's not only Black students, but it's all students of color. And that underrepresentation has long been noticed in my discipline, which is ecology. We have, as a discipline, attempted to address that issue beginning in the 1990s with a program called SEEDS, funded by the Mellon Foundation. And the program aims at recruitment of students into the field. And we recognize as a discipline that there are three major issues that we face as a discipline in trying to diversify the demographics. The first is increasing awareness and essentially enticing students into the field. The second is recruiting them into positions in the field. And the third is retention of students in those fields. And what I want to do today is talk very briefly about awareness and increasing awareness and enticing students into the field. And then perhaps in the panel discussion, we can talk a little bit more about recruitment into the discipline and then subsequent retention. So over the years, I and a number of my students, both graduates and undergraduate students, have looked at changes in the environment surrounding the Howard University campus. And we've done this by taking a walk across town from Howard's campus over to DuPont Circle, from a traditionally African-American neighborhood to a neighborhood that's very untraditionally non-African-American at DuPont Circle, which is largely white. I have worked with a number of undergraduate students as well as with a number of classes. And in those efforts, I and Charlie Nylon at the University of Missouri developed an exercise that we did with students, taking them just on a walk and asking them to do to look at the environment. And one of the things that we did on this walk was initially to look at the vegetation. And here you can see a diagram. This is a satellite image from 1973, and then on the left, and then on the right is that same image in 1997. And the dark areas there, the black areas, are the areas where trees have disappeared during that 25-year period or so. And the close-up in the lower right, again, on the left is the area in 1973, that's Washington, D.C. And on the right is that same area in 1997. As you can see, most of the deforestation, if you will, most of the tree loss occurred in traditionally African-American neighborhoods, in the wards surrounding Howard University, and in the wards that are largely white, in the northwest part of Washington, D.C., you can see that the trees were maintained. There's a long history as to why those trees were lost, and I won't go into that today. Suffice it to say that that has had profound effects on the neighborhood itself. Next slide, please. And one of the effects, of course, is the benefits of having trees. Trees reduce pollution by their presence. They reduce energy because the environment is cooler. They decrease the runoff in terms of water and stormwater impacts. And they decrease pollution levels in large part by helping to capture small particulate matter. Next slide, please. And small particulate matter is of particular importance to human health, in large part because these small particles go all the way into the lungs, as you can see. PM 2.5 in the diagram on the right shows that the small particles actually get down and into the lungs, and where they cause irritation, they reduce lung function, they cause asthma, they influence heart disease, and in fact have been tied to an increase in dementia. There are short-term effects as well associated with smog and the production of small particulate matter. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Which is generally created by vehicular traffic. And so particulate matter is traditionally associated with two things: large amounts of traffic and the absence of trees. Trees reduce wind velocity, letting the particulate matter settle on the ground, and the trees' leaves themselves actually capture small particles and hold those small particles until it rains, and when the rain comes, those particles wash off rather than being thrown into the air. So the presence and or absence of trees is highly correlated with small particulate matter. Now, traditionally, what I did with my students was we walked across town and we looked at vegetation and patterns of vegetation. And we just kind of mapped it in a very traditional ecological sense. In recent years, my discipline has changed its focus to shift and ask, what are the traditional impacts of ecological studies? How can we relate those studies to the human dimension? And what we've done in my course is to relate that traditional mapping of trees and vegetation between Howard University and DuPont Circle, and we map it along with information that we take on air quality. Next slide. And so what we're looking at here are two very different sections. Here's just showing you the 700 block at T Street, right by Florida Avenue. I'm sorry, Georgia Avenue, and then 8 blocks further west on T Street. And you can see that there's a huge difference in terms of vegetation. And you can imagine that there's a subsequent huge difference in air quality as well. Next slide, please. And so these little balloons there indicate areas that my students over the course of years, up until COVID, of course, took data on trees, vegetation, houses, the demographics of the populations there. And these are Q, R, S, and T streets between 3rd Street Northeast and 20th Street Northwest. So a wide variety of data were collected, including small particulate matter. Next slide, please. And this just illustrates the number of cars on U Street and P Street, 2 major crosstown blocks. But what I want to draw your attention to is the decrease in particulate matter the further away you get from that vehicular traffic. So as you get into R and S streets, the particulate matter drops in large part because they're not adjacent to major traffic corridors. Next slide. And so I don't have time to go through the entire set of data. It's quite large, and because it's been collected over many years. But what we've found is that the particulate matter is positively correlated with crosstown street traffic. Areas adjacent to the thoroughfares show higher particulate matter, which I just showed you. We did not find tree canopy data correlated with particulate matter. And my students are now looking to see whether it's the trees themselves, the amount of cover that the trees are producing, and or whether it's the particular structure of the leaves that is in variance. But in general, what we see is that Black neighborhoods have more traffic and fewer trees and higher levels of particulate matter. What that all suggests, of course, is that there are health issues associated with particulate matter in African-American neighborhoods. Next slide, please. And the idea here is that we're no longer just doing science as an exercise in class. We're doing science that has a purpose. What we do is we provide the students with the training, concepts, skills, and opportunities to do traditional science, traditional laboratory exercises, but we put it in a framework that illustrates how the students can use data to examine critical issues affecting populations. And what this does is it not only enables effective participation in public decision-making processes by the students, but it fosters the use of science in the development of just and equitable public policy. So what we're trying to do here is to take traditional science, train students in those traditional sciences, but train them within a framework of using science to advocate for environmental justice. And with that, I'll stop and we'll talk more later, I hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Middendorf. That was an excellent presentation. And now I will stop that share and move on to the presentation by Dr. Schwartzman. There we go. Dr. Schwartzman.
Yes. Good afternoon. I'm Professor Emeritus. I taught at Hira for 39 years. I'm still active as a researcher and an activist in climate justice, energy justice. Second slide, please. Next slide, please. My response to the question, how we can position Howard University to promote climate and energy justice, is the following. Howard's curriculum, research, and societal intervention should take climate science seriously and recognize the real solutions in both the physical and political economies. Next slide, please. Now, this is just one of the examples of the negative impacts of ongoing climate change, of global warming, the well-known fires that have occurred in California, also Oregon, and the year before in Australia. Climate change is driving this, as well as more intense hurricanes and many other impacts that are leading us to a very serious situation in the near future. Next slide, please. So the greenhouse effect is driving climate warming, global warming. Carbon dioxide and methane are increasing in the atmosphere. The pre-industrial level of carbon dioxide was 280 parts per million. It's now over 410 parts per million. And the sources of burning fossil fuel and industrial agriculture. Next slide, please. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2018 recognized that 1.5 degree warming goal is still possible, but it requires deep and early carbon emissions reductions, and of course, very far-reaching changes in all aspects of society. And to meet this goal, we need to get in the next few decades, rapid decreases in carbon emissions, as well as negative carbon emission technology, which means to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and bury it in the crust and in the soil. Next slide, please. So there's a huge social challenge, the state of energy poverty for most of humanity that lives in the global south, and indeed even in pockets of the global north. And conversely, the wasteful consumption of energy in much of the global north, especially the United States. Next slide, please. Now the latest figures actually probably closer to 9 million die every year from air pollution driven by the combustion of fossil fuels and the lack of clean energy in the global south. And this is going on while there was $5 trillion a year subsidies to the fossil fuel sector in the United States, which includes indirect health costs. Next slide, please. This graph indicates the relation in the y-axis of life expectancy versus energy use per capita by nation. And the red arrow is pointing to the global south, which suffers from energy poverty and has below the state of the science life expectancy. To the right are countries mainly of the global north. The blue arrow points to the US, which wasteful use of energy, and indeed a life expectancy that's below the highest that's attainable. The US and Cuba actually have about the same life expectancy, and Cuba, which is under a lot of under embargo and is relatively poor, as a world standard education and health system, and this actually matches the US in life expectancy. Next slide, please. The global south and people of color bear the biggest burden from climate change, and indeed, Black Lives Matter is a global challenge for the climate and energy justice movement. Next slide. Next slide. So preventing climate catastrophe already indicated rapid replacement of fossil fuels by a global wind and solar energy power sufficient for negative carbon emissions, that is sequestration from the atmosphere to bring it down, and the termination of energy poverty now afflicting the great majority of humanity. So I propose there are three imperatives: demilitarize the global economy, solarize it, and transform agriculture to ecological principles, agroecology. The struggles for radical reforms must begin under capitalism and opening up a path to eco-socialist transition. Next slide, please. So there are already existing solar technologies that can do the job. Wind power, which wind, of course, is driven by the solar flux to Earth, so we can call it a solar technology. Solar thermal power, primarily in deserts, and photovoltaics, which many are quite familiar. Next slide, please. Next slide. So how do we get to a 100% renewable energy for everyone on our planet? A global Green New Deal. And in the US, of course, there have already been proposals introduced by AOC of New York and Edward Markey. Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal, I think, improved on this with a cut on the military budget. And Howie Hawkins, who's the presidential candidate of the Green Party, has long proposed an eco-socialist Green New Deal. Next slide. Getting to the end. So what is the main obstacle preventing catastrophic climate change? By the way, this is the cover of my new book, which is in the supplementary slides. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the main obstacle is the military-industrial, fossil fuel, nuclear, state terror and surveillance complex. And clearly the challenge is to defeat fossil capital and its political instruments, such as that person now sitting in the White House. Next slide, I think the last slide. For a PDF of this presentation, email me at dschwartzman@gmail.com, and you can get supplementary slides with further explanation and resources. Thank you for your attention. I'm done.
David, Professor Schwartzman, thank you very much. That was very comprehensive. Thank you very much. And throwing open a great challenge to all of us.
I hope
So
I spent time slot. Okay.
We're going to move now to our final presentation, and that is Professor Charles Verharen from the Department of Philosophy. Oops. Let me see if I can. There we go. Professor Verharen, you are on. You're muted.
Charles Verharen, Department of Philosophy, and now teaching in my 53rd year at Howard. The president of Howard, Frederick, tells me that I'm the longest serving faculty member that he knows about at Howard. Whether the president is correct is a matter for judgment. So the topic is promoting social justice at Howard, and I take all of my cues for this presentation from W.B. Du Bois. So for me, the most important African-American thinker on African-American education, not only in the United States as African-American, but in the world with the African diaspora. Next. John, yeah, thanks. So the presentation is based on a book that is put together from Du Bois's writings called The Education of Black People. and it specifies the ethical obligations of HBCUs. So first, he's claiming that HBCUs have unique missions, and the first they have in common with all universities, first-rate education in solving problems. That's the point of a university, to solve problems. And the universities are justified by solving problems for the communities that support them. But for Du Bois, the overarching mission for HBCUs is to universalize university education. So let's look at Howard in terms of Howard's ethics with respect to its mission as defined by Du Bois. So the first important consideration is student retention rates. And these are hovering around 60%. Four-year graduation rates, again, that's a critical problem. Both of these problems can be dismissed if Howard adopts universal peer tutoring. This is already done at Xavier in the pre-med program, University of Maryland, Baltimore campus. Their retention and graduation rates are approximating 100%, the same as Harvard and Yale and the others. Big question at Howard is, what is our mission? Are we a research university? That's President Frederick's claim. Or are we a teaching university? Some of the opponents of President Frederick make that claim. The resolution, Howard teaches its students how to do research. Now, how can we guarantee that this is happening? If we mandate a senior thesis or a senior project for graduation at the undergraduate level for virtually all students. Is this too much to ask? So what do we do? Well, we have to teach students how to solve already solved problems. That's how they'll get their careers. But we should really be teaching students how to solve unsolved problems. And once students are getting a grasp of that particular skill, then because of Du Bois's ethical injunction to HBCUs, our students should be trying to transfer those problem-solving skills to communities by way of service learning. John. Okay, the second thing that Howard should be doing is taking responsibility for lifelong learning for its alums. So this is best professional practice already at top university, research universities. The tools are easily available, ICT, MOOCs. MOOCs have a problem. Next slide. So we can overcome the problem if Howard mandates lifelong contact with its alums, sets up a website for alumni communities of learning, and focuses the communities of learning by discipline and research interest. Next. So the most important part of Howard's mission is that the alumni do outreach to underserved communities. So this is Du Bois's ethical imperative. So are you going to Howard to get a degree so that you can make money? Extensive money, we hope, in a career? Or are you going to Howard to learn how to transfer your problem-solving skills to the communities that most desperately need your help? So it's the moral life versus the money life. John? So here's Du Bois's most preposterous proposal. This is why I love him so much. He got the idea. Missouri troops in the Civil War saw public education there. They said, why don't we take this back to the South? And Du Bois's preposterous proposal is that someday virtually every human being will have a university education. And he thinks that the primary mission of HBCUs is to serve as a spearhead to that dream, John. So is that too much to ask? How is Howard going to be responsible for making sure that virtually every human being has a university level education? We've got an example of this. John has already mentioned that. It takes care of climate justice and it takes care of social justice, and it does that by setting up agro villages that make education to the university level the most important component of their philosophy. Next. So they started in Benin, and they immediately moved from Benin to Togo and Nigeria, and they're now in these other countries. So they have a presence in 17 African countries. It's an explosion of a concept that can get rid of the global north-south divide. John? So these eco-agro villages can be a global solution to existential problems. They're trying for zero carbon. They are already in their areas where they work eliminating extreme poverty in rural Africa, and they are providing a universal university level education in these African eco-villages. Next slide. So these are Du Bois's final ethical commandments to Howard University. Number 1, spearhead the movement to universalize university education. And number 2, join the movement to universalize eco-villages in Africa. Next slide. So here's my email if you want a copy of the presentation. That's it. This presentation is based on an article our research team published in Western Journal of Black Studies. Next slide. The title of the article is Coupling Ethical STEM Research to Community Engagement at Africana Universities. And there's another journal we just published in Ethics and Education. And the title is The Future of Ethics and Education Philosophy in a Time of Existential Crises. Next slide. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Verharen. That was excellent. So I think we now can move on to the discussion. I believe we have a couple of questions already that have been put up on the question box. And the first one actually is coming to us from one of our professor's colleagues, actually, Professor McDougall. I'm so glad to see you on. So he has a question for Professor Schwartzman. What are your thoughts on Murray Bookchin's social ecology approach? David.
Good question. I think there's certainly compatibility with an eco-socialist vision with social ecology. Matter of fact, there's a lot of overlap. I would stress that the fundamental consideration for a transformation of the energy system is the quality of energy and how much energy. And in the supplementary slides, I've indicated my two books, one co-authored with my oldest son, Peter, and we examine this in depth, and we're convinced that the world needs more energy than it is being consumed now, but from what they call clean energy, wind and solar. There's not really complete agreement about this, and the social ecologists I think tend to underestimate this consideration, but we certainly are in a very good dialogue with them. Thank you.
Sure. Actually, Professor Verharen, your thoughts on the issue? You have to unmute, Prof. You need to unmute.
Panelists. I leave that to the other panelists.
Oh, okay. Professor McDougall, my thoughts on this are that, we need to understand that there are, you know, in terms of that red portion of the planet that I showed where people cannot drink the water, there are people living on $2 a day. There are people who need to be brought up to a level of even basic subsistence. That is a challenge that, you know, when you look at the numbers, they are incredible. It's true that we have, you know, in India, for instance, and in China, we have a growing emerging middle class that is, you know, with the new consumerism and the globalization and so on, huge numbers of middle class consumers in those countries. But at the same time, you have huge numbers just because of the populations of people who are living on $3 a day or less. And if that energy poverty is not addressed, if that equity issue is not addressed, I don't think we're ever going to go towards peace. I mean, the old saying, no justice, no peace, we have to look at justice from a global perspective and from all of these different, you know, facets of equity: environmental equity, technology, resource equity, water justice, and so forth. So those are some of my thoughts on that. Would any of the other panelists like to make some comments? Professor Middendorf.
John, thank you. I think one of the critical issues here is not just one of energy justice, it's a question of justice and resource justice as well. For instance, we want the countries in the equatorial regions to maintain their forests because they're the so-called lungs of the world, and we feel that that they should do that, and yet they're underdeveloped in comparison to the north. So, and yet we don't want to pay them to keep their forests. There are mechanisms through REDD+ and other techniques where we could afford to buy and pay those countries to maintain their forests in their current state, and yet we don't do it, and we won't pay them a sufficient amount of money. We're trying to get it on the cheap. We don't want to pay the going rate, and we don't want to pay them enough to help them move into and move out of poverty and into a middle class life. And so there's some equity issues here in terms of how we deal with resources, and the resources that both they need to develop and the resources we need to maintain our current lifestyle and not to move further into global climate change. And, you know, the recent evidence suggests that we're not going to be able to do this within a 10-year period, even if we get off the pedestal that we've been standing on for the last 2 decades. So there's some real fundamental issues in terms of equity and finance.
Absolutely. Actually, Professor Middendorf, I'm really glad you raised that issue on the equity side in terms of the finance, because that also raises the issue of costing and accounting and what costs, you know, corporations, for instance, actually pay. So a lot of the development that has occurred, that has enabled the global north to develop and grow in the heavily capitalized way it has, is because so many of the costs were not paid for. And here I'm talking about externalities such as environmental costs and social costs for development that is not accounted for. So for instance, you have ExxonMobil, who now, you know, has been sued by Ecuador to the tune of over $500 billion because of the long-term, you know, and extensive environmental damage that has come out of that resource extraction. Meanwhile, Exxon has been sitting pretty on a lot of billions of what's called profits, but those profits are only profits because these externalities are not paid. And so I think that's another issue that we need to, you know, has to be brought into the fore.
Right. I'd also bring this whole issue home, John, because I think this relates to development and the way communities are treated even within the United States. The cost of human life, the calculated cost for human lives, the externalities of dumping and the associated exposures to different communities, the choice of which community to develop or put dump sites in, the choice of communities through which freeways and fundamental commuter routes will be placed. These have all been borne heavily by communities of poverty and communities of color. And the benefits don't go to those communities. The benefits go to the communities who are not of color and who are not poor. And so there are real fundamental issues in terms of the exchange here, not only between North and South, but within our country as well.
Absolutely, George. I'm so glad you raised that issue about equity and in terms of who benefits, because that's one of the big questions that's almost always not asked in terms of who benefits and who actually pays the costs. So this huge infrastructure of freeways and interstates that have been put in place that have benefited a certain class of the population also managed to devastate neighborhoods and communities that those interstates just blasted through. So there are costs that are paid, and who pays those costs and what those costs are need to be addressed. And I think, our students need to be educated about those things to really address issues of equity.
Can I add briefly
Please.
here? My second slide, I indicated that we need changes in not only the physical economy, but the political economy. And that means who's in power. Who holds power? Is it a big corporate elite? Is it, as Bernie called it, the billionaire class, which essentially is true globally? Or is it the people determining in a social managed civilization? And that's really the essence of eco-socialism. But going back to the question of McDougall regarding the social ecology, I'm actually reviewing this book for the journal Science and Society. Brian Togar is now the leader of that institute in Vermont. And the book is Climate Justice and Community Renewal. And he's one of the editors. And I think I've already started reading it. It's really terrific because climate justice movements are growing all over the world, and especially in the global south, where people of the global south are being the most impacted by global climate change. And for example, the climate refugee issue, which is basically generated by the historic emissions from the global north. Why we have so much CO2 in the atmosphere? Well, it's the accumulation of all of the burning of fossil fuel for more than 100 years. And so the global north really has a responsibility to transfer its wealth and resources to the whole world. And we who live in the global north have a responsibility to make this possible. And at the same time, this would actually translate into a better quality of life for people of the global north, especially in the United States. So that's my 2 cents to add.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Schwartzman. I'm looking in the Q&A, the question box and the chat box, and I don't see any other questions. Shalanda, is there any way of knowing how many attendees we have?
There are 8,
Yes,
John.
right now we have 8 attendees.
8 attendees, okay. But is there a difference between panelists and attendees?
So
There is.
they're all together is 15, including panelists
Okay, okay.
and myself.
Right. So
And what about on Facebook?
I can check Facebook. Give me one moment.
Thank you.
Sure.
So
is there any way
John-
that, sorry, go ahead, George.
Yeah, I want to get Ron into this discussion because I think one of the pieces that we're missing here in this discussion is it's not who pays the price. I really would like to hear about who makes the decisions, because I think that's a fundamental issue in terms of who's at the table when the decisions about the roads, the decisions about the cost of trees, the decisions about whether you affect or what kind of legislation you develop. And so these are fundamental governmental decisions that I think really fall out from what Ron talked about earlier.
Thanks, George. So I'll make a couple of comments. First, you know, I think everybody's hit pieces of this in important ways, right? I mean, the corporations have a lot of influence over what goes on, and they've created an impression that the only way that one can develop, we have a model now, right, which is China. And so for a country to develop rapidly, you know, they need to do it the Chinese model. And I think that's dangerous, right? Because what it's done is it said, look, the way that you develop is by not worrying about those externalities, not worrying about the pollution, not worrying about those things that really just need to do it as fast as possible, and you bring lots of people out of poverty. And that's a great thing, that you've brought all those people out of poverty, but can it be done a different way? And that's what I think Chuck and Dr. Verharen and Dr. Tharakan were talking about, was this agroecology. Are there different practices towards development? Now, in terms of the US, you know, political system, the companies have huge influence through campaign contributions, and not just campaign contributions. If you're a politician, what are you worried about? You're worried about getting reelected, but many of these companies are the major employers in your districts. And so they're going to be very influential, even without campaign contributions. And you've got to convince the American public that there's a different path. And so you see this with debates even within the Democratic Party right now about whether we should ban fracking, right? Fracking for gas and oil. And there's a debate and division within the Democratic Party. So you've got to offer a path that doesn't say, hey, the global North, American workers have to give up substantial amounts to make, you know, a path forward. So politicians are going to respond to what their constituents want to some extent. I think the other part, which is where the academy comes in, is the part of ideas. And at least to date, the economists have been really dominant in the overall discussion, right? So they push a market-based approach, and they say, okay, if you want to worry about pollution, then we've got our whole system in here where we'll call pollution externalities, and we'll bring it into the market system and our market analysis. And that's how we should approach it. It's so that, you know, it's the most efficient way. The real failure of economic thinking and approach and analysis is that it's all about efficiency, and it has no way of addressing distribution. It also doesn't have a very good way of pricing non-market stuff. And so things that Dr. Tharakan talked about, you know, roads going in places where, you know, it harms certain communities, economists have no way of addressing that in any way. And so I think that's where the academy can come into play and really contribute. Now, I'll just sort of finish up here by saying, I think we're at a point where people are questioning the process, right? And you see that in terms of the last 2 elections, where a Bernie Sanders could do as well as he's done, where you've got elected people like AOC, where people are actually talking about the Green New Deal, right? And then even on the right, you've got populists who are rethinking whether the current capitalist system is really benefiting most Americans, because they're focused on America. So I think we're at this point where things can rapidly change, and that's sort of the optimistic side, but there's a lot of challenges, I think, in terms of trying to give a path and give a vision for how do you get forward. So I'll leave it there.
Let me just add a quick point here. It's clear that perpetual war and preparation for war is going to lead us to climate catastrophe as well as mass die-off of populations all over the world. So that's why I put that as the main obstacle. And we certainly don't need a new Cold War against China or Russia. We need cooperation. We need a cooperative global regime where changes could occur. And I also like to point out that, yes, indeed, China has a terrible record in terms of environmental destruction and air pollution and so on, but they are making some important steps to address that. They are the leader in renewable energy in the world, and the struggle goes on in China. And matter of fact, I put on the chat a link to my new book, which is The Global Solar Commons, and it has extensive discussion of China in there. So I invite people to check it out. It's free, and I put the link down. It's also on supplementary slides of my PowerPoint presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Schwartzman. I think you raised some important issues about China. And I think, one thing we all need to consider is that it's easy to be an armchair academic when, you're sitting in the ivory tower, but the reality on the ground in China, despite what anybody is going to say, is that over close to half a billion people were brought out of poverty and now enjoy a middle-class consumer-based existence. That is an incredible accomplishment, or rather an incredible transformation of society and the distribution of wealth in that society. So those are some things that need to inform, how change happens. I think Professor Schwartzman raised an important issue about the fact that the state of the current environment really has a lot to do with the fact that the global north is so well developed and has achieved the wealth and status, the wealth and development that it has. And so now it has a responsibility from an ethical perspective to actually bring the rest of the world up into some sort of equity. And so having raised the issue of ethics, I do want to bring Professor Verharen in here as our philosopher to maybe speak a little bit about the ethical issues and the ethical imperatives, perhaps, that drive what Howard and other educational institutions should do. Professor Verharen.
Hey, thanks a lot, John. So I want to piggyback on what you just said. So half a billion brought from extreme poverty to what you call a middle-class life. And that's an extraordinary accomplishment. But what has been the cost to the global health of the environment because of that extraordinary uplift? Well, it's been catastrophic because China is cranking out coal-fired power plants at an extraordinary rate. At the same time, as you said, or David said, they're the world's leader in renewable energy, and so we have this terrible juxtaposition of they've done this extraordinary thing, but they have contributed mightily to global catastrophe with their production of energy. And how are you supposed to balance that? And the balance is clear from what David said, and that's we are able to produce sufficient energy for the entire world's population, perhaps even if the global population goes up to 10 or 12 billion. So that is not a problem at all. So the contest that David has talked about, where we are always on the verge of another catastrophic war. So because of technology, we haven't had a nuclear war since 1945, but we have had these absolutely catastrophic wars, together with all of the terrorism that the global empires, the 5 global empires, are constructing all the time. So reports from the New York Times say that as many as 5 million people have lost their lives in the Eastern Congo precisely because of what the world is doing with the resources available extracted from the Eastern Congo. And so we need those resources for our cell phones, for our turbines, and our wonderful northern life is grounded in 5 million lost lives in Eastern Congo and Africa. And, you know, so what does that begin to look like? Well, the maximum reported genocidal catastrophe in Africa came with the Belgian Congo, and that's actually, some people report as high as 12 billion lives lost. So that has not gone away. 5 million in the Eastern Congo. So is there some way to resolve this in an ethical way? The only resolution is if the entire world goes green on energy, and if we start to eliminate repetitive jobs that pay very little, that require no creative human consciousness. Can we do that now? Yes, we can, because we have artificial intelligence, robots, and other kinds of machines that can do that kind of labor. And so what is the ethical imperative that Du Bois is so concerned about is none of this can happen unless virtually every human being in the world is educated to the point where they can make a creative contribution to the future of life on Earth. So that's the bottom line. It's all possible, but getting us away from the way that we have always lived under an apprehension of scarcity, where, oh my God, I do not have enough to live my life, I must take something from someone else. That has been the universal human pattern of behavior for 300,000 years. It's time to stop that. We have the instruments that can stop that. If we do not stop that, then we will terminate life on Earth. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Professor Verharen. That was that was very excellent. I mean, said it right, spot on. We're about a couple of minutes away from the end time, and I don't see any other questions in the Q&A box.
There is another one, oh,
I'm sorry?
Professor McDougall has another question about China.
Think about how long the Chinese have been at statecraft. Is that the question you're referring to? Okay. A good closing thought.
I think what he's referring to is the Chinese are playing the long game.
Right, right.
Aha.
Okay. 3,000 years. There he said it.
Yeah, but the problem is it's a short game that we have to win, and that's 30 years.
Yes. And those are the various catastrophes that are coming upon us: climate catastrophe, the nuclear catastrophe, and of course, we're all dealing with the COVID pandemic, which is itself a transformative catastrophe of its own, which is why we are having this session here instead of in Blackburn or in one of the wonderful auditoriums on Howard's campus, where all of us could probably be interacting with so many of our alumni who would be coming back on this homecoming week. Given that we're away, I want to thank all of those who have participated, thank all the panelists for coming together and working with us. And I think we put together a great set of presentations. We've had an excellent discussion. All of our presentations will be available as PDFs to any of the participants who want to send us an email. And those email addresses, I think, are on the website, so as well as in our presentations. So please do go ahead, students, colleagues, if you want those presentations, we're happy to share those with you. And so in closing, thank you all again very much for your participation. And I'm going to turn it over now to our tech support, Ms. Shalonda Colbert.
If I could just get in 1 second to Professor McDougall. Africa has been at statecraft on written record for the past 5,000 years. So I think we need to pay very careful attention to that record at Howard University and the other HBCUs. Thank you.
All right, excellent, thank you. Okay, Shalonda, do we just terminate the session, or are there any closing remarks from the
There are no closing remarks. I want to thank you all for participating and hosting a wonderful panel. And that is it. You guys have a great weekend and stay safe.
Thank you very much. This was wonderful. Thank you all, colleagues and participants. Everybody stay safe. Look forward to speaking with you all again at some point.